is Memorial Day, and we remember those who have given their life in service for country, and but also I think that we should be remembering how we ought to live in light of those who have sacrificed. Like, you don't just live however you want without any gratefulness or gratitude. And then on top of that, I think that there are many, including Paul, who we've been studying, who literally gave his life in service for the Lord's mission, for the Lord's work, and he died in order to promote the freedom that we know in Jesus Christ. And then ultimately, above all, that God gave his own Son, the loss of his own Son for our lives, for eternal freedom, for salvation in Christ. And I think that those things certainly, although we honor military about as high, that sacrifice about as high as any earthly sacrifice, that we certainly wouldn't put it above what God has done for us and the gratitude that we ought to have. So in Philippians, we're continuing here in 1:27, and Paul says this. He says, "But only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Jesus Christ." He says, "So that whether I come to you or am absent," he says, "that I may hear that you are striving with one spirit, in one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel." So Paul says, whether or not I make it back, whether or not I return to you, whether or not I'm ever released from this prison, he says, I want to hear that you guys are continuing in these things, that you are striving side by side. And first and foremost, he says that you are living worthy of the gospel of Jesus Christ. You know, I think the people in those days probably had maybe a fresher thought in their mind that they had just heard, that they were, I don't know if you can think deeply enough about the thought that if there was nothing ahead, if there was just blackness ahead or hell ahead, and there was just nothing and no way out, if there was nothing and no way out, and God had given his Son to die in your place, that you may have eternal life. There is no level of worthiness that you ought to live your life in. No shortage of the level of worthiness. He says, I want to hear that you're living worthy of what he did for you, that you're remembering what Jesus Christ has did for you. And, just dwelling on the freedom that he has given to us. And he says, worthy of the gospel of Christ. And, I think if the richest person you knew or the richest person in this church were to give everything they had to the poorest person they knew or the poorest person in this church, and that person just walked around in snooty, selfish, self-centered attitude, everyone who knew the situation would be like, what an ungrateful snot. What a snob. What an absolute, they should not have gotten anything. They deserve nothing. Why did this even happen? Why did this take place? And when Paul says that he wants us to live worthy of the gospel, this is once again one of those things that I believe is so simple that we can't think about it really close enough. Like, it's so simple, yet it is something that I think is so important. He says, let your manner of life. That means like every daily choice you make, you're just going through your day, and what is it? What is it that you do? Is it self-centered? Is it caring? Is it thankful? Is it grateful? Is it what does your words sound like? What does your speech sound like? How bold are your actions? How meek are your actions? What does your manner of life look like in light of worthiness of what Jesus did for you? What is your daily life like? He's like, I want to hear, even if I never make it back, I want to hear that your manner of life is worthy of what was done for you. He says, I want to hear this. It is so important that you would be humble and giving, and like that you would have just, I don't know how to say it, maybe this isn't even a phrase, but I was thinking like mercy and generosity, like off the cuff. Like, it is a given because what Jesus did for me. Like, I live my life worthy of what he has done for me, that this is what people see out of me. And when they look at me as a Christian, as someone who's had this freedom and this blessing bestowed on me, that they're like, oh yes, they definitely live in a manner worthy. They do not take advantage of that. And he says, so that I may hear that you are striving side by side in one spirit, in one mind. And he says, for the faith of the gospel. And I think, I think this is really neat because he's like, I want to hear that you're in one spirit and one mind and striving side by side for the faith of the gospel. And I think what's cool about this is when you have a group of people, a whole church, who is all living in gratefulness, that they're all living with this grateful attitude and this thankful attitude, that they would all be brought together. Because if you have a bunch of people who are snooty and snobbish and conceited and thinking that they made their own way in life, that there's no gratitude in their lives, they're probably, when you put them all together, it's going to be an outburst, right? It's going to be a mess. It's going to be a disaster, right? But he says, I want to hear that you're all in one mind. And the only way you can do that is all in humility and gratitude and gratefulness and thankfulness. Like, that's the only way that you're going to come together without hearing that there's snippety talk between them, that there's not cutting and fighting between them, because they're all in one mind, he says, in one spirit, and he says, striving side by side. That you know, how great is it, you know, who doesn't want friends? Who doesn't want companionship? Who doesn't want partnership? And he's like, if this has happened in your life, I'm going to see that that you're walking side by side because you're all fixed on the faith of the gospel. You're all living in this extreme gratitude so that when you're walking, it's like we're a team, right? We're together. We're side by side. We're arm in arm. And this is the way that one would think. This is going to be funny when I've gone on 3 pages past my notes and I have no idea where I am. But again, I just have to point that out. But this is the sort of thing that happens in gratitude. If it was your son who had died for the freedom of others, you would fully expect that those who lived in gratitude would live in like a subdued arm in arm, gratefulness, that there would be no fighting, no complaining, that they would be living in like this, I don't even know how to spit it out what I'm saying, but you get what I'm feeling? Like you would fully expect that in gratefulness, it would have brought you together like that, right? You would think, oh my goodness, this individual freed us from slavery and freed us from like awfulness and death, and we should all be like, yes, together we bind together in one joy moving forward, right? We should think that would be exactly what you would see in the church going forward with the forgiveness in Jesus Christ. And then he goes on to say this. He says in verse 5, he says, actually, I want to just look back at what he had said in the past already. He said earlier in chapter 1, verse 5, he's talking about how he's just in this constant joy. And he says this, because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. And he's like, I'm just celebrating the fact that we're just so close together because what has happened. He's like, we're just one. Like, we all became partners when Jesus died for us. We all became like together and close, and like you just bound to me. And then he says in verse 7, he says, I hold you in my heart because you're partakers with me in this. He says, when we saw what Jesus did for us, he says, you guys just flocked together. It's like we became this tight-knit group that pushed together for the sake of the gospel, that we stood together. And he's like, I don't feel alone even if I'm in prison because we're all thinking grateful, right? We're all thinking this grateful attitude that we're just striving together for one cause because of what was done for us, because of the sacrifice that was made for us. It brought us together in this way. And then he says in verse 28, moving forward here, he says, not frightened in anything by your opponents. And this is interesting because we have these enemies who stand against us. And really, this should bring a camaraderie as well. Like if we have common, if there was some enemy lurking outside of this building, we certainly should find commonality in one another, that we're striving one another against, he says, against a common enemy who's out to get us, right? He says that we shouldn't be frightened in anything by our opponents. And then he says this, he says, this is a clear sign to them of their destruction. And he says, but of your salvation, and that from God. And I think that this is really interesting. He says, when you are not afraid of what is going to happen to you, when you're not scared of like the things that the world is throwing at you, and you realize that in this, Paul is in prison. Paul is like, your words that you say, and I'm telling you, I've seen some scary stuff lately. Words can land you right smack in prison. They can. We're getting really near to that in a lot of words that you can choose. in certain places you can get in big trouble for words. But he says, you guys, he says, I don't want them to see fear in you. He says, I want you to stand up, and he says, when you stand and you speak the truth, you say, this is right before God, and God says this is right, and this is what we stand for, and the truth is that Jesus died for us, and that there is salvation in him alone, and that this is the only way, and there is one right, and God is God, and he is my Lord, and I stand without fear before you. He says that this sends a message. He says this is a clear sign to them that they will end in destruction, but they should know by this that you will be saved, and that by God. He says that there is something in this, that when you cower in fear and you hide and you say, oh, I'm so ashamed to tell you what I really believe in. He says that's not sending the message. And I just notice in this letter perpetually, Paul is very emboldened in what he says. Paul is very bold in what he stands for. There's no backing off in what Paul stands for. He wants us to stand in what is right and stand in that very firm. And one thing I thought was interesting about this is when he says that there's something about it when you don't back down. He says there's some sign that it sends that they know deep in their heart that there is judgment for them and that there is salvation for you when you stand for what is right and you don't become cowardly about it. And my brother was talking this week. We have this, well, I guess it was last week, but we have this family group chat that we discuss things, and one of my siblings was talking about some opposition that she was facing in her town about trying to stand for what was right and having a lot of smear happening about it, and they're cutting her down. And she was worried about maintaining friendships and not like becoming condemning looking to people. And she wanted people to know that she cared about them but still stood for what was right. And one of my brothers said, you know, he has spent a large amount of his life sharing the gospel with people, and he said, you know what, you never have success, in my opinion, when you've not stood for what is right, because there is no respect for you. There's no platform built. But he said, no matter if they disagree with you, he says, I have found that if you stand for what is right over and over, when the time comes, they respect your opinion, and they know that it's different, and they know that there's something in it, and they know that it's truth. And he said, that's when it really happens to you. But if your life has been a pushover, when everything that maybe, could be offensive, that you weren't different, you didn't stand indifferent, there was no change in your life, there was nothing condemning about your life, not that you meant it to be, but the simple fact that God asked us to live in the right way, if that didn't show in your life, he says there very few people will respect when you tell them how to turn to God. He said it's very, very important that we don't worry about what people think of us, that we don't become ashamed because God says what God says. It's something very important that we stand in. So it says here in verse 29, he says, for it has been granted to you, for Christ's sake, that you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for him. And I think that this is really interesting, because he says, you know, it has been granted to you, almost like it's been gifted to you. Not only that you should believe, because a lot of us would like to think, we believe, right? That's like all God wanted for us. He wanted me to believe in him. But he says, this has been granted to you, that you would suffer for him. You're like, he granted to me? Like he gifted to me? He's like, it doesn't end with this, you guys. He says it doesn't end with your belief. He says it has been granted that first you would believe, and then you would suffer for the sake of what you stand for. You know, and you think of, you know, the people who go before us may face greater persecution, but, you know, especially like you think of like veterans. Like, what would veterans from the past think of us now? Would they be like, I guess they overturned what you fought for, and we didn't even notice. You know, probably somewhere in the past that has happened over the years, right? And we just think, you know, when Christ has bought us and redeemed us from something, and those before us have died for something, and then we are like, I don't know as though we need to suffer for this. I don't know as though we need to stand for what is right. It says here that it has been granted to you, to the people who follow after, that you would believe and then make a stand, that you would stand and hold firm to what has been given, that you would suffer the persecution, that each and every one of us would suffer the persecution for Christ's sake. And, you know, this is kind of, as we're trying to bring this a little bit to a close here, but I think, you know, when I was working in construction, many times, you know, I would know that I had somebody that I had to get rid of working for us, and I was like, you know, I think we're kind of getting to the point where we don't need as much help as I thought we, or well, maybe we, I don't know, something like that. That's just about how well I brought it across, okay? And I'm like, so you may as well, kind of pack up some tools, just in case. And they're like, but we got 3 months of work in this building. And I'm like, yeah, but not for you. You're like, I don't know, I'm not good at delivering. I'm not good at delivering a message. Funny. But anyway, you're like, that was a little late. But anyway, you're like, it's not good when somebody says, that's all we have for you. A lot of times it'd be like, well, just in case the company has something else for you on Monday, maybe just take your tools this weekend, and they'd be like, I know exactly what you're doing, But he says here, it hasn't been granted for you just to believe, but he says it's been granted for you to suffer. He says it's not like you're done. He says you're here to make a stand. You're here to make a difference. You're here to be the salt and light. You're here to make a physical change in the world around you. You're here to do something. You're not done. I'm not telling you that there's no more work for you. I'm telling you there is work for you, and you need to be that work. You need to do those things. You need to stand up to the persecution that's faced before you, because that is your job, that you would stand up to the persecution before you. It's been granted to you that you would do that. And I think that here Jesus says in Luke 9:22, he says, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes. And he says, and be killed and be raised again on the third day. And then he says this, he just says like literally die. And then he says this, he says, so therefore anyone who wishes to come after me must pick up his cross daily and follow me. He says, if anybody wants to walk with me, they better pick up the cross. They better be willing to die. They better be willing to suffer. They better not be somebody who doesn't plan on doing anything when they pick up the cross. If you're coming, you too will pick up a cross. You too will suffer with me. You too will make a statement in this world. And I think, I don't know how to say this, but this world shames us right now for making a stand. It's shame, shame, shame. As if we have something to be ashamed of because our doctrine differs from the world. But God said, I have a job for you, that you would be a light in a dark world, that you would stand in contrast to an enemy who's going to attack you, that you would uphold what I said when those before you have died, that you would be, unfortunately, you may just suffer, and that is good, right? If there's no suffering, you may wonder if you're not doing what you ought to do. So here in closing here, he says, that you would also suffer for Christ's sake, engaged in the same sort of conflict that you saw that I am in, that you saw that I had, and still hear that I still have. What kind of conflict is that? Like, you're persecuted. You're maybe put to death. You're thrown in prison. You're like all of these things that Paul went through, that's what's for you. Like, he did it first. He went before us, but now we will stand. Now we will stand for what is right, and we will not be ashamed. If we're ashamed of what is right, then the light of right versus wrong has been lost. He says, I have called you, and this is something that, I'm really going to try and close with this. This is something that I hate to bring in culture, and I hate to bring in politics, and I hate to bring in stuff that's argumentative. But I'm telling you, this world is working day and night to shame out of us standing for what is right. That we would just, we want to feel like the world's worst cowards who really shouldn't poke at anything that is wrong. But our job is to stand and say this is right and this is wrong. And we're supposed to face persecution. And if we want to hide, I've just never quite realized until this book of Philippians how strong we're supposed to be. I've never quite realized how Paul says it's okay if they're all talking bad about me, because that's making waves, and they're talking about what is right versus what is wrong, and I'm happy about it, even though I'm in prison. I've never realized our job was this bold before. Never before this book. It's the last few weeks has set into me, oh my goodness, it's our job to be bold. It's our job to stand for what is right. It's our job to pick up the cross. It's our job to be persecuted. It's our job to face what may come against us. It's our job to let people know what the Bible says. It's our job to say, no, there's only one right, and it's what God says. That's our job, and we shouldn't be cowards in that. It's very, very, very important. So that was nothing like my notes, but we got through it, right? And I hope that this really rings true to you, that we need to be bold. There are so many people around us who need to hear what we have to say, and we are very, very reluctant many times to say it. And not only that, but if our life doesn't live in a manner worthy of the gospel, how are we supposed to say it? So first off, live in a manner worthy of the gospel. Let your speech be grateful and kind, and not cutting and fighting, and let us stand together in unity. And secondly, then you need to make a stand and say, this is because God said it is, and this is what it is. It's so important that we do that. It's so important that we do that. So let's go ahead and close in a word of prayer this morning. Our God and Father, I just pray that you would just give us the courage to be what we ought to be. I just pray that you just help us to live in a manner that is grateful and worthy of what you have done for us, that you literally entered our world in human form and died and bought us from sin, and that we should not mess with it, we should not toy with it, that we should not be arrogant, that we should not cut others down, that we should not live any part of away from humility, but that we would strive together, that you would find us arm in arm and hand standing for what is right, that we would bind together and give courage to one another, that we could take a stand in this world no matter what happens, knowing that eternity is all that will matter to us, Lord, that you would just make us who you want us to be and who we ought to be instead of who we tend to drift into being, Lord. And I just pray this in your Son's name. Amen.